Ladies and gentlemen, today I want to talk to you about something that many of us struggle with at one point or another in our lives. The barriers that keep us from moving forward into the purpose that God has set for us. And it's not just about moving. It's about advancing in the divine calling He has uniquely placed on each of our lives. One of the biggest barriers that prevent us from moving forward into the purpose God has set before us is the fear of the unknown. It's easy to stay where we are because it's comfortable, even when we know deep down that God is calling us to something more. The unknown can be intimidating. We can't control what's ahead, and that lack of control makes us anxious. We want to know the outcome, to see the path clearly laid out before us, but faith doesn't work that way. God calls us to trust Him in the unknown. When God calls us to step into something unfamiliar, our natural instinct is often to hold back. We want a blueprint. We want a timeline. We want to see exactly how everything will unfold before we make a move, but that's not how faith operates. Faith requires us to move even when we can't see the whole picture, to trust that the same God who has been faithful in the past will continue to lead us forward, even into uncharted territory. The fear of the unknown often manifests as questions and doubts. What if I fail? What if I'm not equipped for this? What if I make the wrong choice? These fears can paralyze us, but the reality is fear of the unknown keeps us stuck. It traps us in a cycle of indecision, and the longer we stay there, the further we drift from the purpose God has for us. We can't move forward if we're constantly looking back, dwelling on what we've known or how we've lived. Sometimes God doesn't show us every step because He wants us to rely on Him and not our own understanding. The moment we think we have everything figured out is often the moment we stop trusting in His guidance. When we move into the unknown, it's not about our ability to predict or control, but about our willingness to trust in the one who holds the future. Stepping into uncertainty can feel like stepping into darkness, but it's in that place that God reveals His light, leading us forward one step at a time. Another major barrier that stops us from moving forward into the purpose God has for us: self-doubt and insecurity. This internal struggle can be even more paralyzing than external challenging, because it often comes from within. We begin to question our worth, our abilities, and whether or not we are truly capable of fulfilling God's calling. The voice of doubt whispers in our ears, telling us we're not good enough, that we don't have what it takes, or that we don't deserve what God has promised us. Self-doubt is a powerful tool that the enemy uses to derail our destiny. It creeps in quietly, almost unnoticed at first, but soon it can dominate our thoughts and decisions. We may start to believe that God could never use someone like us because of our flaws, mistakes, or past failures. In our eyes, we see our weaknesses and imperfections as obstacles, but God sees them as opportunities to display His strength and grace. The truth is, God doesn't call the qualified, He qualifies the called. It's never about our own ability. It's about trusting in His ability to work through us. Insecurity often stems from comparing ourselves to others. We look around and see others seemingly confident, talented, and successful, and we start to feel like we don't measure up. We forget that God has a unique purpose for each of us, and comparing ourselves to someone else only distracts us from our own journey. No one else can fulfill your calling the way you can, because no one else has the exact combination of experiences, gifts, and passions that you have. But when we're consumed by insecurity, we can't see the beautiful things God has placed within us. There's also the fear that if we step into the calling God has for us, we'll be exposed for who we truly are. We worry that we'll fail and that everyone will see our weaknesses. The enemy uses these fears to keep us in a constant state of self-doubt, preventing us from moving forward. But the truth is, God already knows our weaknesses. He already knows our shortcomings. He still calls us. His power is made perfect in our weakness. When we acknowledge our insecurity and step forward in faith, God takes our frailty and turns it into strength. The battle with self-doubt and insecurity is real, but it's also a battle we can win. We can choose to trust in God's promises rather than our own limited perspective. We can choose to believe that God has equipped us with everything we need to fulfill the purpose He has placed in us. Our identity is not defined by our doubts, our insecurities, or what others think about us. Our identity is defined by who God says we are, His beloved children, chosen and empowered to do great things. One of the most significant obstacles that keep us from moving forward into God's purpose is the weight of past failures and regret. It's easy to look back at the mistakes we've made, the opportunities we've missed, and the paths we've taken that led to disappointment, and allowed those experiences to define who we are. We often think, I've messed up too much. I've failed too many times. How could God ever use someone like me? The pain of regret can cloud our vision, making it seem like we are disqualified from God's promises. But this is a lie the enemy wants us to believe. The problem with holding on to past failures is that we allow them to shape our future. Every mistake, every misstep can start to feel like a permanent mark on our lives. We replay the moments of failure in our minds, and each time we do, it's like we're living them all over again. That kind of thinking keeps us stuck in the past, trapped in a cycle of shame and guilt, unable to move forward with the hope and confidence that God has for us. We begin to believe that our past mistakes somehow make us unworthy of God's calling. But God doesn't see us through the lens of our failures. He sees us through the lens of grace. God's purpose for our lives is not determined by our history. It's determined by His divine plan. The truth is, He is a redeemer. He doesn't just forgive us, He redeems and restores. He takes our brokenness, our mistakes, and our regrets and turns them into something beautiful. He doesn't erase our past, but He repurposes it. Our history can be used as a testimony of His grace, a testimony that proves that no matter how far we've fallen, He is still able to raise us up and carry us into the future He has for us. When we hold on to past failures, we're essentially saying that God's grace isn't enough to cover them. We're telling God that His forgiveness isn't complete, that we are somehow beyond His redemption, but His grace is sufficient. It is more than enough to heal, restore, and equip us to walk in His purpose. The Apostle Paul himself, who once persecuted Christians, went on to become one of the greatest leaders in the early church. He knew firsthand that God's grace could transform even the deepest regret into a powerful testimony of God's love. Regret often has a way of magnifying the mistakes we've made, but it can never overshadow God's ability to turn those mistakes into something purposeful. When we release the grip of past failures and choose to forgive ourselves, we allow God to do what He does best, make all things new. We don't need to be held back by the shame of what we did or didn't do. Instead, we can trust that God is working all things together for our good, even the parts we wish we could erase. One of the greatest hindrances to stepping into the purpose God has for our lives is comfort. It might seem counterintuitive at first because who doesn't want to be comfortable, right? We seek comfort in our homes, our relationships, and even in our careers. We want things to be predictable, manageable, and free of challenges. But the truth is that comfort often keeps us from moving forward into the destiny that God has prepared for us. Comfort breeds complacency. It settles us into a place where we're no longer striving for the more that God has for us. We become satisfied with the status quo, content with what we have and where we are, even though deep down we know that God is calling us to something greater, something more fulfilling. Comfort in itself is not bad. There is nothing wrong with having a peaceful life or enjoying the blessings that God has given us. The issue arises when comfort becomes our ultimate goal, when it becomes the thing we prioritize above everything else. This is when comfort turns into complacency. Complacency is the enemy of growth, and it is often the very thing that keeps us from walking in God's full purpose for our lives. The trap of settling for less, the temptation to settle into comfort is real. It's easy to get comfortable in the place we're in, even when we sense God calling us to step out of our comfort zones. Settling for less than God's best for our lives is one of the most dangerous things we can do. There's a voice inside of us that says, "This is enough, I'm fine where I am. Things could be worse, so I should be grateful." And while there's truth in being grateful for the blessings we have, we cannot allow that sense of contentment to keep us from reaching for more. When we settle, we often convince ourselves that we're being humble or wise by staying where we are. But in reality, we're simply avoiding the discomfort of change. We want the security of what's familiar, the safety of knowing what comes next. But God is not a God of stagnation. He is a God of movement, progression, and transformation. He is always calling us to grow, to stretch, and to step into new territories, even when it feels uncomfortable. The fear of leaving our comfort zone can keep us from experiencing the fullness of God's blessing. Our comfort zone may feel safe, but it can also be a prison. It can trap us in a cycle of mediocrity where we're just getting by, but never really thriving. God doesn't want us to simply survive. He wants us to live abundantly. The abundant life He offers requires movement, risk, and often a little discomfort. The illusion of control. One of the reasons we seek comfort is that it gives us a sense of control. When things are comfortable, we feel like we can predict the outcome, and we know how to handle what's in front of us. But in reality, we are not in control, and our comfort is an illusion. We can never truly control life's circumstances. No matter how much we try to protect ourselves from the unknown, God often calls us into situations where we are forced to let go of control and trust Him completely. It's in these moments when we have to surrender our desire for comfort and control that we experience the power and presence of God in the most profound ways. But the more we cling to comfort, the more we resist trusting God fully. When we try to control every aspect of our lives, we are essentially telling God that we don't trust His plan for us. We are saying that we would rather hold on to what we know, even if it's less than what God has for us. Comfort creates a false sense of security, and as long as we're looking for that false security, we will resist the new things God wants to do in us and through us. God's call to growth and stretching. Comfort is also dangerous because it makes us complacent in our spiritual growth. In our walk with God, growth is not optional. It's a command. God calls us to grow in our faith, to be transformed into the image of His Son. But transformation requires discomfort. It requires us to step out of our old ways of thinking, our old habits, and our old patterns. Transformation requires us to be stretched beyond what feels comfortable. In the Bible, we see countless examples of people who were called to step out of their comfort zones in order to fulfill God's purpose. Abraham was called to leave everything he knew and step into a land that was unknown to him. Moses was called to lead the Israelites out of slavery, a task that felt impossible to him. Jesus Himself had to step out of the comfort of heaven and into the chaos of earth, all for the sake of His purpose. Each of these individuals was called to embrace discomfort in order to fulfill a greater calling. When we choose comfort over calling, we miss out on the transformation that God wants to do in our lives. God does not want us to remain in the same place, spiritually, emotionally, or even physically. He wants us to grow, to mature, and to expand into the fullness of who He has created us to be. The power of discomfort. Discomfort is not something to be feared. It's something to be embraced. Discomfort is where we experience growth. It's where we learn to rely on God in ways we never could have if we stayed in our comfortable, predictable routines. Discomfort pushes us to trust God more deeply, to lean into His strength instead of relying on our own abilities. When we are in a place of discomfort, we are forced to depend on God's. We have to pray more, seek His direction more, and trust Him more. It is in these moments of vulnerability and uncertainty that we experience the deepest intimacy with God. Discomfort brings us closer to God because it forces us to confront our fears, our insecurities, and our need for His guidance. The Israelites, when they were freed from slavery, were led into the wilderness, a place of discomfort. They were no longer in the comfort of Egypt, but they were not yet in the promised land. God led them into the wilderness on purpose. It was in that place of discomfort that God revealed Himself to them in powerful ways. It was in the wilderness that they learned to trust Him daily for provision, protection, and guidance. Just like the Israelites, we often find ourselves in seasons of discomfort and transition. These seasons can feel painful and uncertain, but they are also the very places where God shapes us, refines us, and prepares us for the greater things He has in store. Without discomfort, we would remain stagnant, never growing into the people God is calling us to be. Breaking free from complacency, breaking free from the grip of comfort and complacency is not easy. It requires intentionality, courage, and a willingness to take risks. But the first step is acknowledging that God is calling us to more. We have to recognize that there is a higher purpose for our lives than simply staying where we are. God has a calling on your life that requires you to step outside of your comfort zone. It requires you to take risks, to embrace uncertainty, and to trust that He will equip you for what He has called you to do. He will never call you to something without providing the strength, wisdom, and grace you need to fulfill it. But you have to be willing to take that first step. You have to be willing to break free from the security of your comfort zone and embrace the unknown with faith. As long as we continue to settle for the comfort of where we are, we will never fully experience the depth of God's purpose for us. The abundant life that God has promised is not found in the safety of complacency. It's found in the courage to step out and follow Him into the unknown. It's found in the willingness to trust Him, even when it means leaving behind what is comfortable and stepping into what is uncertain. One of the most difficult and often unnoticed obstacles that can prevent us from fully walking in the purpose God has for our lives is the weight of expectations. These expectations come from many different places: family, friends, society, and sometimes even from within ourselves. Each of these expectations can either push us toward our calling or, more often than not, hold us back from stepping into the destiny that God has uniquely prepared for us. The pressure to meet these expectations can feel overwhelming, and it often leads us to question if we are making the right choices, living in the right way, or even walking the right path. In a world that constantly pushes us to measure up to certain standards, the expectations of others, combined with our own self-imposed standards, can drown out the voice of God, leaving us uncertain of our true calling. The weight of external expectations from the moment we are born. We are bombarded with the expectations of others. Parents, teachers, and mentors all have their ideas about what we should become. Often these external pressures come from a place of love and concern, but they can still be a heavy burden to bear. The desire to meet these expectations, whether to succeed academically, financially, socially, or in our career, can cause us to lose sight of the unique path God has designed for us. For example, our families may have dreams for us that are shaped by their own desires, experiences, and even disappointments. They may expect us to follow a certain career path, attend a particular school, or make decisions that align with their vision for our future. While there's nothing inherently wrong with these suggestions, when we start to live out someone else's dream, we find ourselves stepping out of God's purpose for our lives. Instead of being guided by God's vision, we are driven by the external pressures of meeting someone else's expectations. These pressures don't always come with ill intent. Parents want what's best for their children, and friends want us to succeed in ways they believe are important. However, when these expectations begin to feel like a heavy weight, they can hinder us from stepping into what God has called us to do. We may find ourselves striving to meet the expectations of others to the point that we lose our own sense of direction, becoming disconnected from our true purpose and calling in God. The expectations of society, in addition to pressure we feel from those close to us, there is the constant barrage of societal expectation. Society paints a picture of success that is often defined by material wealth, social status, and external achievements. We are told that success equals having the right job, the perfect family, the ideal body, and a certain level of wealth or fame. These societal standards shape our decisions, often leading us to chase after things that are fleeting and ultimately unsatisfying. The pressure to live up to these ideals can be crippling. Many of us feel like we have to keep up with the Joneses, always striving for more, achieving more, and proving our worth through external accomplishments. This kind of pressure can cause us to question our value, especially when we don't meet society's benchmarks for success. We start comparing ourselves to others, wondering if we are doing enough, if we are good enough, or if we will ever measure up. Social media exacerbates this problem as we are constantly exposed to curated images of people's seemingly perfect lives. The comparison trap becomes an ever-present temptation, and we are made to feel as if we are falling short, even when we are exactly where God wants us to be. The problem with these societal expectations is that they often do not align with God's purposes. God's definition of success is radically different. It's not about how much we accumulate or what others think of us. It's about faithfulness to the calling He's placed on our lives, regardless of the external pressures. The expectations we place on ourselves in many ways, the hardest expectations to deal with are the ones we place on ourselves. We hold ourselves to impossible standards, believing that we must always do everything right, perform perfectly, and meet our own self-imposed deadlines. We believe that in order to be worthy of God's calling, we must prove ourselves by our achievements and accomplishments. The constant pressure to be perfect can lead to burnout and exhaustion. When we don't meet our own expectations, we feel like failures, and this shame can lead to a cycle of self-doubt and frustration. We may believe that if we don't live up to our own ideals, we are somehow unqualified for God's purpose, as if our worth is tied solely to our productivity and success. The desire to succeed, perform well, and be competent is not inherently wrong. But when we place these pressures on ourselves to the point of sacrificing our peace and our relationship with God, we move away from the heart of what He desires. God doesn't call us to a life of constant striving and endless pressure. He calls us to walk in freedom, trusting that His grace is sufficient and that He is the one who equips us for the purpose He has called us to fulfill. The disconnect between expectations and purpose. One of the most dangerous outcomes of living under the pressure of expectations is that it can lead to a disconnect between our daily lives and God's ultimate purpose for us. We may be so focused on meeting the demands of others, whether family, society, or ourselves, that we forget to pause and listen to what God is saying. The noise of external voices drowns out the still, small voice of God, calling us into deeper intimacy with Him and into the unique purpose He has for our lives. When we live under the pressure of expectations, we may begin to chase after things that are not aligned with God's will for us. We may pursue careers or goals that are driven by the need for approval or validation, rather than by a clear sense of God's calling. We may sacrifice relationships, health, and peace in the pursuit of external achievements that do not bring lasting fulfillment. God's purpose for our lives is not determined by what others expect of us. His plan is far better than any human dream. But when we allow ourselves to be led by external expectations, we miss the opportunity to walk in the fullness of what God has prepared. We are called to live by His standards, not the world's, and to seek His approval above all else. The freedom of breaking free from expectations, the key to overcoming the pressure of expectations, is to recognize that God's purpose for our lives is unique and personal. We were created for something specific, and the only way to walk in that purpose is to stop measuring ourselves by the expectations of others. We need to release the need for external validation and learn to listen to God's voice above all else. When we choose to align our lives with God's purpose rather than the expectations of others, we experience true freedom. This doesn't mean that we ignore the people around us or reject the wisdom of others, but it does mean that we make God's calling our top priority. We learn to set boundaries, to say no when necessary, and to embrace the path that God is leading us down, even if it doesn't align with societal norms or the expectations of those around us. This freedom allows us to step into the calling that God has for us without fear or hesitation. It removes the weight of others' opinions and places our focus on the eternal significance of our actions rather than the temporary approval of people. God's calling is not contingent upon the validation of the world. When we embrace our purpose, we embrace the freedom that comes with knowing we are fully loved and accepted by God, regardless of what anyone else thinks. The importance of seeking God's voice ultimately. The key to navigating the pressure of expectations is to seek God's voice above all others. We need to spend time in His presence, listening for His guidance, and trusting that He will lead us into the purpose He has for our lives. When we are anchored in His truth, we are less susceptible to the shifting winds of external pressure. We become confident in the path God has chosen for us, knowing that He is faithful to fulfill His promises. By focusing on God's voice, we can begin to break free from the pressure of expectation. We can let go of the fear of disappointing others and embrace the peace that comes from knowing we are walking in alignment with God's will. This is the key to true fulfillment. Not meeting the expectations of others, but faithfully following the call of God on our lives. When it comes to pursuing God's purpose for our lives, one of the most significant challenges we face is the lack of patience and perseverance. These qualities are often overlooked, yet they are fundamental to walking in God's calling. In a world that prioritizes instant gratification, quick results, and immediate success, we are often ill-prepared for the slow, steady, and sometimes difficult journey that God calls us to walk. Patience and perseverance are not just about waiting for the right moment or enduring hardship. They are about trusting God's timing, refusing to give up when things get tough, and staying faithful even when we don't see immediate results. But for many of us, the temptation to rush ahead, the pressure to perform, or the discouragement of not seeing progress can make us abandon the path God has set before us. The world's culture of instant gratification, one of the most prominent issues that hinder our ability to develop patience and perseverance, is the culture of instant gratification in which we live. We are constantly encouraged to pursue quick results, whether it's through social media likes, the fast pace of career advancement, or the ability to instantly access information at our fingertips. This culture creates an environment where we expect things to happen quickly. And when they don't, we can become impatient, frustrated, or even cynical. However, God does not work on our timeline. His ways and timing are so much greater than anything we can comprehend. While we may be looking for instant success or immediate results, God often works slowly through seasons of growth, testing, and refining. This is where patience becomes essential. Learning to trust in God's perfect timing, even when it doesn't match our immediate desires. The Bible is full of examples of people who had to endure long periods of waiting before seeing God's promises fulfilled. Think of Joseph, who was sold into slavery by his brothers and then spent years in prison before being elevated to a position of great influence. His journey was long and filled with hardship, but it was necessary for the fulfillment of God's purpose. God's plan for Joseph didn't happen overnight, and neither does His plan for us. The temptation to rush ahead when things don't happen as quickly as we want. It's easy to feel tempted to rush ahead, to force things into motion, or to take shortcuts. We may begin to feel like we have to make something happen because we see others succeeding. Or we may become tired of waiting and begin to question if God is really moving on our behalf. This temptation to rush can take many forms. Sometimes it looks like pushing ahead in our careers, relationships, or ministries, trying to make things happen in our own strength. Other times it looks like a sense of impatience with the slow progress of spiritual growth or personal development. We might look at someone else's success and wonder why it's taking so long for us to experience the same breakthroughs. We may begin to believe that God has forgotten about us or that we're not on the right path. The problem with rushing ahead is that it leads us to act outside of God's will and His timing. We may end up making decisions based on our own desire for control or comfort, rather than trusting God's sovereign plan for our lives. But the truth is, God's work in our lives is often done through the process, not in the instant. He is far more concerned with our character, our integrity, and our faithfulness than He is with how quickly we arrive at a destination. Patience teaches us to wait, to trust, and to surrender our timing to God's will. The test of perseverance, while patience helps us endure the waiting periods, Perseverance is the ability to press on despite obstacles, opposition, and frustration. It is the determination to keep going even when it seems like nothing is changing or when the road ahead appears unclear. Perseverance is critical to fulfilling God's calling because it is often through difficulty and struggle that we experience the most growth. Trials and setbacks are a part of the journey. Jesus himself told his followers that in this world, they would face tribulation, but they could take heart because he had overcome the world. John 16:33. Perseverance doesn't mean that we won't face challenges. It means that we keep going in spite of them. Consider the Apostle Paul, who faced incredible trials in his life and ministry. He was beaten, imprisoned, shipwrecked, and yet he kept going. He understood that his calling was bigger than the obstacles in his path. In his letter to the Hebrews, Paul encourages believers to run with perseverance the race marked out for us. Hebrews 12:1. This kind of perseverance isn't natural. It's a gift that comes from trusting God's faithfulness and relying on his strength when our own strength fails. There will be seasons in our lives when we will want to quit, when it will feel like the dream God has placed in our hearts is too far out of reach. Perseverance is the quality that will keep us from giving up when things get tough. It reminds us that the race isn't won in a single moment, but by keeping our eyes fixed on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. Hebrews 12:2. Patience in the process. God's purpose for our lives is not just about the destination. It's about the process of becoming who he created us to be. The process may involve times of struggle, doubt, and frustration, but it is in those moments that God shapes us. Patience allows us to endure those moments without losing heart. It helps us to wait, not passively, but actively, trusting that God is working even when we can't see it. Psalm 27:14 says, "Wait for the Lord, be strong and take heart and wait for the Lord." This verse doesn't call us to wait idly. It calls us to take heart, to be strong, and to continue trusting God while we wait. God uses the waiting seasons of life to refine us, to teach us to depend on him fully, and to develop perseverance within us. The journey is just as important as the destination because it is through the process that we become more like Christ. In the same way that a seed must be planted, buried, and nurtured before it can grow into a tree, our spiritual growth often requires a period of hiddenness. We may feel like nothing is happening, like we're in a season of waiting with no apparent progress. But just as the seed is working underneath the soil, God is working in us even when we don't see the fruit yet. Trusting God's timing ultimately. The root of impatience and a lack of perseverance often lies in a lack of trust in God's timing. We may feel like we need to make things happen on our own, but true patience and perseverance come when we surrender our timelines to God's perfect plan. God's timing is always right, even when it doesn't align with our own. We may not understand why certain things are taking longer than we expected, or why it feels like God is silent in certain areas of our lives, but his timing is never off. He is always working behind the scenes, even when we don't see it. The Bible is full of promises that remind us of God's perfect timing. Ecclesiastes 3:11 says, "He has made everything beautiful in its time." It's easy to become frustrated when things don't happen when we think they should. But God's timing is always for our good and his glory. When we trust that he is in control of our timing, we can have the patience to wait and the perseverance to keep moving forward, even when the way seems unclear. The reward of patience and perseverance, the journey of patience and perseverance is never easy, but it always leads to a reward. James 1:4 tells us, "Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." God uses these qualities to shape us into the people he has called us to be. As we develop patience and perseverance, we grow stronger in our faith and more deeply connected to God. Patience teaches us to trust in God's sovereignty, and perseverance teaches us to rely on his strength when we face challenge. Together, these qualities help us to endure the hardships of life and stay faithful to the purpose God has set before us.